Well, to discuss if race relations in the U.S. have taken a step backwards in recent years, I'm joined now from Rhode Island by Tricia Rose. She's a director at the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America at Brown University. And in Washington, D.C., we're joined by Christopher Harris, who's executive director of Unhyphenated America. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Christopher Harris, let's start with you. 60 years on after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on that bus, is there still a battle for civil rights in the United States, particularly for African Americans?
Thank you, Imran. You know, it's interesting. I had a conversation with my father on the way.
It seems to me there's a tremendous...
He's actually...
Sorry, Tricia, could Christopher have a go first?
Sure.
I'm sorry. I was saying that I was speaking to my father on the way in, and my father's actually of that age group, born and raised in Detroit. And, you know, I was asking him, Dad, hey, you know, from your perspective, are race relations better today than they were before? And he says, well, yeah, on a day-to-day basis, they are better. But, you know, are there problems? Of course there's still problems, but that's a human nature thing. You know, when somebody asks the question, you know, how are race relations, I always like to go back to, like, an economist always says, well, compared to what? Or more accurately, compared to when? I mean, compared to 60 years ago, when my parents were growing up in Detroit and South Carolina, when you had, you know, no Negroes allowed to drink from a water fountain or whatever like that. Well, obviously, things are a lot better today. There are some who would say that things are more systemic, that they're more hidden today. But the overall question is, on a regular basis, are your unalienable rights being affected? I think most people, if they're being honest, they'll say no. But, you know, once again, we have to go back and say, on a day-to-day basis, you know, what are your day-to-day interactions like? The answer is no.
Okay, but in response to that, names are symbols, right? Rosa Parks' name is a symbol. There have been symbols in the past year and a half as well. Freddie Gray, Laquan McDonald, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice. These names mean a lot to people because these people are dead now. Many feel it's a system rigged against the black man that is responsible for their deaths. Are these isolated incidents, or is the system rigged against the black man?
Well, you know, it's kind of a loaded question, because when you say, is it loaded against the black man, last time I checked, when I was shaving in the mirror, I'm a black man, and I don't have the same experiences that, you know, a Freddie Gray or anything might have. So, you know, it's compared to what? Compared to me, I don't have those same problems, and most of the people that I know and interact with don't have those same problems either, Imran. So, you know, you have to kind of drill down further. You can't make just such a broad general statement to say, oh, it's bad, it's rigged against the black man. Who are you talking to? Are you talking to people who are in the largely or predominantly African-American communities, as you will? And, you know, what are their experiences as opposed to somebody who is black and might have grown up in the suburbs or whatever like that? What are their experiences? I think it's a lot more nuanced than simply to say racism is worse today.
Okay, so Tricia, are there two African American experiences then? The one in the suburbs versus the one in communities that are struggling? Is that at the heart of it?
No, I don't believe so. But of course, the African American and the black community, which includes black people from all over the world, you know, have a wide range of experiences for sure. We don't want to create a monolith in our conversation. However, there are significant statistical pieces of data that show significant differences across race. That is to say, what academics might call structural racism, which is a set of practices that produce substantial disadvantages, but they don't rely on the kinds of visible, street-based, public accommodations, kinds of segregation that you saw under Jim Crow, which harkens back to the Rosa Parks reference that you made a few minutes ago. So if you're looking on the social everyday level, you're generally, unless you're talking about the police in poor neighborhoods, you're generally talking about a much more harmonious day-to-day experience.
There's been an African-American president in the White House for the past 7 years. Do you feel let down by him?
Well, you know, I didn't have high expectations in the first place for Obama, not so much related to him personally, but because I understand the contradictions about how some call colorblind racism works. That is to say, you have a majority of white Americans who believe in equality across race, and that allows them to imagine that someone like Obama could be an equal participant in running for president, not all, but a large number. But at the same time, you have a complete denial that there's significant structural racism going on. So the very same people who voted for him have also been pretty resistant to any kinds of policies that address structural disparity. There's been a tremendous hostility to that.
A lot of people are uncomfortable with a presidential candidate, or at least a Republican candidate, Donald Trump, and everything that he said over the past few months on the campaign trail. As potential president, Trump has lashed out against the Black Lives Matter movement, against Muslims, against Mexicans. The 4 suspects charged with shooting Black Lives Matter protesters were chanting Trump 2016 and race war. Does all of that not make you feel a little bit uncomfortable?
There's a lot of other things that make me feel uncomfortable going into certain neighborhoods. You know, that there's a socioeconomic status that if you go into a particular neighborhood at the wrong time of the day, wrong time of the night, you're just as likely to end up being murdered, you know, to be robbed, raped. I mean, like I said, my family is from Detroit, and virtually every member of my family in Detroit who grew up in predominantly black neighborhoods have been robbed at one point at gunpoint, have had their cars stolen, all that. So yeah, those things are also concerns. So I mean, it's to sit there and act like,
hold on. Somebody
issue
robbing you on the streets is not running for office. They don't have political power. You have somebody actively disparaging minorities versus somebody who might hold you up for your wallet. Aren't you making a false equivalence here, Christopher?
Yes. No, I'm not making, because, well, what are most people, how many people are affected on a, quote, day-to-day basis by Donald Trump or even President Obama? You know, you're more affected by what goes on in your local neighborhood than you are by the president. And I think most people, if they're willing to be honest, will say that the role of the presidency of the executive branch is primarily to take care of national security and things such as that. That's why he's commander-in-chief first and foremost. So you're more affected by the local politics than you are by presidential politics. That being said, you know, there are a lot of things that Donald Trump has said that that people will agree with, and there's a lot of things he said that personally, I don't agree with. I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump. There's nowhere where you'll find me being supportive of him. I don't have anything personally against him. I just don't support him. But, you know, going back to the whole idea of President Obama,
actually, this is a
as,
really
Dr.
interesting point.
Okay, let's get Tricia to come in. Tricia?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. You know, I've been
Tricia.
reading recently, due to my own research, on the fair housing laws and the passage of, you know, federal law that said that you could not discriminate against any group of people for housing privileges, rights, and access. But once Nixon became president, he made sure that there was almost zero enforcement. In fact, the records show that he specifically said, what is the bare minimum I can do to apply this law, but also make it ineffectual? And so over the course of the next 15 to 20 years, not a single community was penalized for its discriminatory activities. So when your other guest says that the federal branch is just there for national security, but not there for affecting your day-to-day lives, this is a rather profound example of the ways in which a law designed to create equity was absolutely nearly gutted and created a condition in which no punishment, no penalty for significant discrimination was taken care of. So it's very important that we pay attention to the broader policies of the people who are not only in the White House, but in Congress and in the Senate. These things have tremendous impact locally.
Final question for you, Christopher. Do you believe that the Black Lives Matter movement is necessary?
No. Not the way that, or at least not the way they're going about doing things. You know, if you look at the civil rights movement, one of the things that they pointed out was, I am a man. We are human beings just like you. And you know what? That resonated with people across the board. But when you're running around like the Black Lives Matter movement is running around saying, oh, you know, listen, I know people say, oh, all lives matter, Black lives matter. But the bottom line is, when you make it clear, I am a human being, what you're doing is you're connecting with other people. But when you're isolating yourself and saying, Black lives matter, people's natural reaction is saying, well, okay, I'm a human being, what about my life? So what you're trying to tell me is that your life matters and my life doesn't. what you should do, it's a really, really simple message. It's really just simple psychology. If you say all lives matter, if you say I'm a human being like you're a human being, treat me, that's what civil rights are about. Treat me the same way that you would want to be treated. Isn't that what the golden rule says?
Okay. Final response.
I mean, it's really simple.
Okay. Final response from Tricia to that.
No, actually, I agree with the principle that all lives matter. And in fact, the reason that I Am a Man was such an effective campaign mechanism for the Memphis garbage strike in 1968 is that it was a context in which the idea of manhood or womanhood or humanhood for black people was completely denied by the Jim Crow. It was a racial hierarchy caste system. What we have now is a whole new way in which racial ideology works. So you can say, hey, I believe in equality, and I think all people should be created equal, are created equal, and should be treated equally, and that in fact we should have a meritocracy. And at the same time, this very same people will support policies that substantially disadvantage some members of our society. And so you can't simply say all lives matter, because that feeds this colorblind illusion that racial inequity is not happening. That's not the context of Rosa Parks. That's not the context of Martin Luther King. So we need new ways of illuminating the way race and racial discrimination is happening, because it's happening in a very new social arena.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Tricia Rose and Christopher Harris, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Imran.